Chad Daybell. What if the man you trusted to lead your family, to guide your children, was secretly plotting the end of the world and your death along with it? In a quiet Idaho neighborhood, Chad Daybell lived what looked like an ordinary suburban life. He was a husband, a father, an author. To neighbors, he was a man of faith. But beneath that veneer lay something far more sinister, a self-proclaimed prophet who believed the apocalypse was coming soon, and that some people around him were already dead, even if they were still breathing. Daybell wasn't a household name at first. He wrote niche religious novels, stories about near-death experiences, visions of the afterlife, and the last days of Earth. His followers were few, but loyal. They saw him as a man who had been chosen to interpret God's will. And then Lori Vallow walked into his life. Lori was magnetic, beautiful, and deeply enthralled by his apocalyptic preaching. Together, they built a theology that placed them at the center of the end times. According to their belief system, some people were light and others were dark. And the dark ones, they were zombies, soulless shells, their spirits overtaken by evil. And once you label someone a zombie, eliminating them isn't murder, it's purification. In 2019, Lori's teenage daughter, Tylee Ryan, and her adopted son, 7-year-old JJ, Vallow, vanished. Lori brushed off concerns. She told friends that everything was fine. When police came asking questions, she spun story after story. JJ was with a friend in Arizona. Tylee was away at college. But investigators weren't buying it. Meanwhile, Chad's wife of nearly 30 years, Tammy Daybell, suddenly died in her sleep. No warning, no medical history that explained it. Just weeks later, Chad remarried Lori. Friends whispered, "Who moves on from a spouse's death that quickly?" The timeline didn't just look suspicious, it looked damning. In June 2020, investigators closed in. They searched Chad's property. Dogs sniffed the ground, shovels hit the dirt. And then, the unthinkable. Human remains were unearthed in his backyard. It was JJ, bound in duct tape, discarded like trash. It was Tylee, dismembered and burned, her young body reduced to fragments. The idyllic author's home had become a clandestine graveyard. The trial in 2024 was the final act of this horror. Prosecutors painted Chad as a manipulator, a man who used religion not to save souls, but to justify killing children. Lori may have been volatile, they argued, but Chad was the architect. He dug the graves. He hid the evidence. The defense tried to cast doubt, suggesting Lori was the driving force, but the jury saw through it. They found Chad guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and multiple charges tied to the deaths of JJ, Tylee, and Tammy Daybell. The sentence was clear: death. And now, as of August 2025, Chad Daybell sits on Idaho's death row. His legal team is appealing, but his conviction has already gone down as one of the most notorious family annihilation cases in modern U.S. history. But here's the question that still haunts everyone who followed this story. How did a fatherly figure, an author writing about heaven, become a stepfather who buried children in his own backyard? Was Chad Daybell a believer consumed by delusion? Or was the apocalyptic religion just a mask for something darker that was always inside him? Because the line between prophet and predator is thinner than we want to admit. George Jefferson Hassell. Picture this. A dusty Texas morning in 1928, the smell of ozone hanging heavy in the air as leather straps are tightened around a man's wrists. George Jefferson Hassell sits in the electric chair, his weathered farmer's hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of 13 lives he'd systematically erased across 2 decades. But how does a simple tenant farmer become one of America's most prolific family annihilators? The year was 1917, when neighbors in rural California first noticed something wasn't quite right about the Hassell household. George had married a widow with children, presenting himself as a hard-working man ready to provide for a ready-made family. What they couldn't see behind the facade of domestic tranquility was a predator who viewed his new stepchildren not as souls to nurture, but as obstacles to eliminate. The first massacre unfolded with chilling, methodical precision. One by one, Hassell murdered his wife and her children, burying their bodies in shallow graves around their property. But this wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated execution. He had planned every detail, from the timing of each murder to the disposal of evidence. When suspicion finally mounted, Hassell simply vanished, leaving behind a property that would later reveal its horrific secrets. What makes Hassell's case particularly terrifying is what happened next. Rather than disappearing into obscurity, he reinvented himself in Texas, finding another unsuspecting widow with children. The pattern repeated with bone-chilling similarity. George Jefferson Hassell had discovered his calling. He was a family collector, gathering vulnerable women and children only to systematically destroy them. The Texas household operated under the same sinister dynamic. Neighbors would later describe Hassell as a quiet, unremarkable man who seemed devoted to his new family. Children played in the yard, laundry hung on lines, and life appeared completely normal. But behind closed doors, Hassell was already planning his second family annihilation. The stepchildren had no idea they were living with a man who had already perfected the art of making entire families disappear. The discovery came in 1926 when authorities, investigating reports of missing persons, began excavating the Texas property. What they found defied comprehension. Bodies buried in multiple locations, evidence of systematic violence, and clear signs that these weren't random killings but carefully orchestrated murders. The scope of the horror became clear. Hassell hadn't just killed again, he'd killed everyone. During his confession, Hassell displayed an almost mechanical detachment from his crimes. He described the murders with the same matter-of-fact tone another man might use to discuss crop rotation. There was no remorse, no explanation beyond a chilling pragmatism. These people had become inconvenient, so he eliminated them. The stepchildren, ranging from young children to teenagers, had been murdered simply for existing in his path. The trial that followed captivated the nation. Here was a man who had committed not one but 2 complete family annihilations, crossing state lines and decades to perfect his murderous craft. Prosecutors painted a picture of unprecedented domestic terrorism, a predator who specifically targeted blended families, exploiting the vulnerability of widowed mothers and their children. As of today, criminal psychologists still study the Hassell case as an early example of what they now recognize as the family annihilator profile. But what set Hassell apart was his mobility and patience. He wasn't driven by sudden rage, but by a sustained pathology that allowed him to plan, execute, and repeat his crimes across multiple states and years. On that Texas morning in 1928, as 2,000 volts coursed through George Jefferson Hassel's body, justice was finally served for 13 innocent victims. But his legacy raises haunting questions. How many other George Hassels have walked among us, and how many blended families have unknowingly welcomed predators into their homes? William G. Gravlin. Imagine trusting your life to a man whose job is to save people from burning buildings, only to discover he's been planning to burn down your entire world. On a cold Michigan night in 1964, Royal Oak fireman William G. Gravlin would transform from community hero to family executioner in one horrific evening that would leave 7 people dead and a nation questioning who we really know behind closed doors. Gravlin represented everything Americans wanted to believe about the men who married their widowed neighbors. He was a respected fireman, a man who ran toward danger to save others, someone who had taken on the responsibility of raising 5 stepchildren alongside his own daughter. To the outside world, he was the epitome of the dependable stepfather, strong, protective, and committed to his blended family. But on that fateful night in Troy, Michigan, William Gravlin would reveal the monster that had been hiding behind the uniform. What transformed this supposed protector into a cold-blooded killer remains one of the most chilling mysteries in the annals of family annihilation cases. The methodical brutality of his crimes suggests this wasn't a moment of madness, but the culmination of something far more sinister. The massacre began after the family had settled in for the evening. One by one, Gravlin moved through the house with an axe and other weapons, systematically murdering each family member. His wife, his own daughter, and all 5 stepchildren, ranging from young children to teenagers, were brutally killed in what can only be described as a domestic holocaust. The violence was so extreme that investigators would later struggle to piece together the exact sequence of events. What makes Gravlin's case particularly disturbing is the evidence of premeditation found at the scene. He had left notes of apology on some of the bodies, twisted attempts at explanation that revealed a man who understood the magnitude of his actions, yet proceeded anyway. These weren't the ravings of someone who had snapped. They were the calculated communications of someone who had planned this carnage. The stepchildren, who had trusted this man to protect them, became victims of the very person who should have been their guardian. In their final moments, they must have looked into the eyes of their stepfather and seen not love or protection, but the face of their executioner. The psychological trauma of such betrayal extends beyond the immediate victims to challenge our fundamental assumptions about family safety. When police arrived at the scene, they found a house transformed into a charnel house. 7 bodies, multiple weapons, and those haunting apology notes that suggested Gravlin knew exactly what he had done. The man who had once rescued people from burning buildings had created his own inferno of violence, one that consumed an entire family in a single night. The legal proceedings that followed were as complex as they were tragic. Questions arose about Gravlin's mental competency. Could someone who committed such systematic violence be considered sane? The defense argued for insanity, pointing to the extreme nature of the crimes and the bizarre apology notes. But prosecutors countered that the methodical execution of 7 people required a level of planning that indicated full awareness of his actions. Ultimately, the court found Gravlin competent to stand trial, a decision that would seal his fate. The evidence was overwhelming: 7 bodies, clear signs of premeditation, and a defendant who had shown no signs of mental illness prior to the murders. In the late 1962, William G. Gravlin was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, ensuring he would never again have the opportunity to betray the trust placed in him. As of August 2025, the Gravlin case continues to haunt criminal psychologists and sociologists studying family violence. Here was a man whose profession demanded the highest levels of trust and heroism, yet who perpetrated one of the most brutal family annihilations in American history. His story serves as a chilling reminder that the greatest dangers to children often come not from strangers, but from those we invite into our homes and hearts. The 7 victims of William Gravlin's rampage, including 5 stepchildren who should have found safety in their blended family, remind us that evil can wear the uniform of a hero, and that trust, once betrayed, leaves scars that extend far beyond the immediate tragedy. Lee Ford, what would you do if the person you trusted to protect your children became their executioner? In the quiet Cornish village of Carnkey, England, this nightmare became reality when Lee Ford, a seemingly ordinary stepfather, transformed into one of Britain's most notorious family annihilators. Over the course of 24 horrific hours in 2000, Ford would systematically murder his wife and all 4 of her children, leaving an entire family extinct and a community forever scarred. The Ford household appeared to be a typical blended family success story. Lee had married Leslie Ford, taking on the role of stepfather to her 4 children, one 7-year-old Sarah Jane, one 6-year-old Anne Marie, one 4-year-old Stephen, and one 3-year-old Craig Tranter. From the outside, they seemed like any other working-class family trying to make their way in rural Cornwall. Neighbors would later describe them as quiet, unremarkable people who kept to themselves but appeared to be getting along well enough. But behind the facade of domestic normalcy, something sinister was brewing. What drove Lee Ford to commit such unspeakable acts remains a subject of intense psychological speculation. Was it financial pressure, resentment toward his stepchildren, or had he always harbored the capacity for such monstrous violence, waiting for the right moment to unleash it upon the innocent people who trusted him most? The killing spree began on what should have been an ordinary day in the Ford household. One by one, over the span of 24 hours, Ford systematically murdered each family member. The methodical nature of these killings suggests this wasn't a sudden explosion of rage, but rather a calculated decision to eliminate his entire family. Each stepchild was murdered individually, which means the others would have known something terrible was happening. The psychological terror they must have experienced is almost incomprehensible. Sarah Jane Tranter, at 17, was the eldest and likely understood the full horror of what was unfolding. Anne Marie, just 16, was barely beginning her adult life when it was brutally cut short. Stephen, only 14, and Craig, the youngest at 13, were still children who should have been worried about school and friends, not fighting for their lives against their stepfather. Each represented a unique tragedy, dreams unfulfilled, potential unrealized, lives snuffed out by the man who was supposed to protect them. What makes Ford's case particularly chilling is what happened after the murders. Rather than immediately confessing or attempting suicide, common patterns in family annihilation cases, Ford attempted to hide the bodies. This calculated effort to conceal his crimes demonstrates a level of premeditation and cold-bloodedness that places him among the most dangerous types of family killers. He wasn't driven by guilt or remorse. He was trying to get away with mass murder. The discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves through the tight-knit Cornish community. Carnkey was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where families had lived for generations, where the most serious crimes were typically petty theft or public drunkenness. The idea that a stepfather could systematically murder an entire family was beyond their comprehension. How do you process the reality that someone living among you was capable of such evil? When Ford finally confessed, the details that emerged painted a picture of systematic brutality that defied explanation. 5 people who had welcomed him into their lives, who had trusted him with their safety and future, had been methodically executed by the man who should have been their protector. The confession provided facts but no real answers. What could possibly justify the murder of 4 children and their mother? The legal proceedings that followed were as straightforward as they were devastating. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Ford pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder in 2001. The judge, recognizing the unprecedented nature of the crimes, sentenced him to 5 life terms, ensuring that Lee Ford would never again have the opportunity to destroy another family. The multiple life sentences reflected not just the number of victims, but the magnitude of betrayal involved in each murder. The Carnkey murders exposed uncomfortable truths about the vulnerability of blended families. These 4 children had no choice in their stepfather's selection. That decision had been made by their mother, who paid for her trust with her life. The case became a stark reminder that the stepfather role, which should represent protection and guidance, can sometimes mask predatory intentions. The impact of Ford's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims. Extended family members were left to grapple with survivor's guilt and the knowledge that an entire branch of their family tree had been severed in a single act of violence. The community of Carnkey struggled to understand how they had failed to recognize the warning signs, if indeed there had been any to recognize. Lee Ford's name became synonymous with one of the most heinous acts of domestic violence in British criminal history. His case continues to be studied by criminologists and psychologists trying to understand the mind of a family annihilator. But perhaps the most important lesson from Carnkey is the simplest. Evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who pose the greatest danger. The Tranter children, Sarah Jane, Anne Marie, Stephen, and Craig, deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a crime study, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by unspeakable betrayal. Their stepfather took everything from them, but their memory serves as a reminder of the preciousness of family bonds and the devastating consequences when those bonds are perverted by evil. Joseph David Hurd. Picture this. A 2-year-old child, barely able to form complete sentences, looking up at the man who was supposed to be his protector. Now imagine that same man systematically inflicting torture upon this helpless toddler until his small body could endure no more. This is the horrific reality of the Joseph David Hurd case, a crime so depraved that it challenges our understanding of human evil and forces us to confront the darkest possibilities of stepfather abuse. In Gulfport, Mississippi, little Hayden Lee Bataille should have been experiencing the simple joys of early childhood, learning to walk confidently, discovering new words, playing with toys, and basking in the love and protection of his family. Instead, He found himself trapped in a house of horrors with Joseph David Hurd, a stepfather whose capacity for cruelty knew no bounds. What transforms a man into someone capable of torturing a toddler? The answer may be more terrifying than we're prepared to accept. The evidence presented during Hurd's trial painted a picture of sustained, systematic abuse that defied comprehension. This wasn't a case of discipline gone wrong or a momentary loss of control. This was deliberate, calculated torture inflicted upon one of society's most vulnerable members. Prosecutors detailed a pattern of repeated abuse that escalated over time, suggesting that Hurd derived some twisted satisfaction from inflicting pain upon a child who was completely powerless to defend himself. Hayden Lee Batai's final days were filled with unimaginable suffering. At 2 years old, he possessed no understanding of why this was happening to him, no concept of what he might have done to deserve such treatment, and no ability to escape or seek help. His world, which should have been filled with love, learning, and laughter, instead became a nightmare of pain and terror. The psychological impact of such abuse on a developing mind is almost too horrific to contemplate. What makes Hurd's crimes particularly monstrous is the deliberate nature of his actions. Child abuse experts testified that the injuries inflicted on Hayden were not consistent with accidents or even typical physical punishment. Instead, they revealed a pattern of intentional torture designed to cause maximum pain and suffering. This wasn't discipline. This was sadism directed at a helpless child who trusted the adults in his life to keep him safe. The prosecution's case revealed the systematic nature of Hurd's abuse. Medical evidence showed that Hayden had suffered multiple injuries over an extended period, indicating that his torture wasn't a single incident, but rather an ongoing campaign of violence. Each day brought new horrors for this innocent child, who had no way to understand why the man who was supposed to love him was instead causing him such agonizing pain. During the trial, the courtroom was filled with hardened law enforcement officers, experienced attorneys, and seasoned court personnel. Yet many struggled to maintain their composure as the full extent of Hurd's crimes was revealed. The evidence was so disturbing that even professionals accustomed to dealing with violent crime found themselves shaken by the deliberate cruelty inflicted upon such a young victim. Hayden's mother had entrusted her precious child to a man she believed would help raise and protect him. Instead, she had unknowingly placed her son in the hands of a predator who would systematically destroy his small body and snuff out his young life. The betrayal wasn't just against Hayden, it was against every principle of family, trust, and human decency that holds society together. The jury's verdict was swift and decisive, guilty of capital murder. The evidence was overwhelming, the crime was heinous, and the victim was as innocent as any person could be. When the judge pronounced the death sentence in May 2024, many felt it was the only appropriate response to such unprecedented cruelty. Joseph David Hurd had forfeited any claim to mercy through his systematic torture of a defenseless child. What sets the Hurd case apart from other instances of child abuse is the calculated nature of his cruelty. This wasn't neglect or even violent discipline. This was torture inflicted upon a toddler for reasons that may never be fully understood. Child psychologists struggle to explain what could drive someone to deliberately inflict such suffering on a 2-year-old who posed no threat and possessed no ability to defend himself. The death sentence handed down to Joseph David Hurd represents society's ultimate condemnation of his crimes. In a justice system that reserves capital punishment for the most heinous offenses, his systematic torture and murder of little Hayden Lee Bataille was deemed worthy of the ultimate penalty. The message was clear. Some crimes are so depraved, some betrayals so complete, that they warrant the strongest possible response. Harrison County's courthouse had seen many disturbing cases over the years, but the Heard trial stood out for its sheer brutality and the innocence of its victim. Hardened prosecutors admitted this was among the most difficult cases they had ever handled, not because of legal complexity, but because of the emotional toll of confronting such deliberate cruelty toward a helpless child. Little Hayden Lee Bataille's brief life ended in unimaginable suffering, but his memory serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of children in blended families and the devastating consequences when trust is placed in the wrong hands. His stepfather took everything from him: his childhood, his future, his very life, in acts of cruelty that challenge our understanding of human nature itself. Bruce Thomas House. What if the monster wasn't hiding in the shadows outside your home, but sleeping down the hallway, waiting for the moment when your guard was down? This is the story of Bruce Thomas House, a stepfather in Masterton, New Zealand, who turned two young girls' bedrooms into their graves. A man whose violence ripped through the quiet fabric of a small town, leaving an entire country horrified at how evil could live unnoticed behind suburban walls. In the early 2000s, Masterton was a town where everyone knew everyone. But even in a close-knit place, secrets can thrive. And inside one home, two sisters, one 2-year-old Sally L. Jalessa Applin and one 1-year-old Olympia Marissa Jetson, were living a nightmare they couldn't escape. At school, the girls were bright, cheerful, and inseparable. Teachers described them as best friends as much as sisters, always looking out for each other. But behind their smiles, there were whispers. Friends noticed bruises, relatives worried about tension at home, and at the center of it all stood one man, Bruce House, their stepfather. House had a reputation. He was volatile, controlling, and abusive. Neighbors noticed his temper. Family members suspected things weren't right. Yet, like so many domestic abusers, he operated in the shadows, hiding cruelty behind closed doors, while presenting himself to the world as just another working-class man trying to keep a household together. But the truth was darker. For years, Saliel and Olympia lived under his thumb, enduring abuse they were too young to process, let alone escape. And while authorities saw glimpses, concerns raised here and there, they never saw enough to intervene decisively. And then came the night where the whispers ended and the horror could no longer be ignored. December 4th, 2001, a night that began like any other. The girls brushed their teeth, changed into pajamas, and went to bed. Their mother wasn't home. That left only House in charge, a fact that it would seal their fate. Sometime after midnight, House entered their bedroom. He wasn't holding a bedtime story or a blanket. He was carrying a knife. The attack was swift, silent, and merciless. Both girls were stabbed to death where they lay, still under their covers. Olympia was just 11, barely at the start of adolescence. Saliel, at 12, was only a year older. They had no chance to run, no chance to scream. Their final moments were spent in the place where they should have been safest, in their beds. When police arrived, the scene was devastating. Officers who had walked through gang killings, car crashes, and violent assaults would later say this case stayed with them forever, not because of the brutality alone, but because of the innocence lost. 2 children, slaughtered by the man entrusted to protect them. News of the murders spread rapidly. In New Zealand, where violent crime is relatively rare, the shockwaves hit hard. Masterton, a small town, suddenly became the center of the nation's grief and outrage. Vigils were held, families held their children tighter, and the question echoed everywhere: how could this happen? Howes was arrested almost immediately. There was no mystery about who had committed the killings. The only mystery was why, and even that, chillingly, had a simple answer: control, rage, and a lifetime of violence condensed into one night of murder. In 2002, Howes stood trial for the murders of Saliel and Olympia. The prosecution laid out the case in stark, devastating detail. Years of abuse, culminating in a night of pure savagery. Witnesses spoke about the warning signs. Experts explained the psychology of abusers like him. The defense had little to stand on. There was no alternate suspect, no alibi, no accident to blame. The evidence was overwhelming, and so the jury's decision came swiftly: guilty of murder on both counts. The judge handed down one of the heaviest sentences New Zealand had ever seen for such a crime: life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 28 years. For a country where parole eligibility often comes much earlier, the sentence was a statement. It told the nation the killing of children, especially by the very man meant to protect them, would be punished with the harshest penalty the law could offer. And so, Bruce Howes disappeared behind prison walls, destined to live out decades in a cell. But for Masterton, the scars remained. The sisters were gone, their futures stolen. Their classmates grew up without them. Their family lived with the empty space left behind. Rick Thorburn. What if the man trusted to care for a child killed her to cover up his own family's darkest secret? Queensland, Australia, 2015. A 2-year-old girl named Tia Lee Palmer vanished on her way to school. She never made it to class. She never came home. Within days, her foster family went from being seen as her protectors to the prime suspects in one of Australia's most disturbing child murder cases. At the center of it all was the man who was supposed to keep her safe: her foster father, Rick Thorburn. Tia Lee Palmer was just 12 years old when her life intersected with the Thorburn family. She had been placed in their care by the foster system, a system meant to protect vulnerable children by placing them in homes deemed stable and trustworthy. On the surface, the Thorburns seemed like that family. Rick Thorburn and his wife had taken in foster children before. They lived in Chambers Flat, south of Brisbane, in what looked like an ordinary suburban setting. To the outside world, they appeared to be doing good work helping children who needed stability, opening their doors to those who needed a home. But behind that facade lurked danger. Inside the Thorburn household, control and secrecy ruled. And for Tia Lee, the home meant to be her safe haven would soon become the place of her greatest betrayal. On the 30th of October 2015, Tia Lee was dropped off at school by Rick Thorburn, but she never attended her classes. Teachers marked her absent. Hours passed, then days. Her disappearance sparked immediate concern. Police were called. A missing persons case was opened. Her foster parents made pleas for information. On television, they spoke as though they were desperate for her return. But cracks in their story began to show. Just 6 days later, a grim discovery was made. A fisherman spotted a body washed up on the banks of the Pimpama River. It was Tiali. She had been murdered. The news rocked Queensland. Vigils were held. The foster system came under scrutiny. How could a 1-2-year-old, placed in the care of supposed guardians, end up dead in such a brutal fashion? The investigation quickly turned inward. Police began scrutinizing the Thorburn family, and what they uncovered wasn't just a crime of murder, it was a web of lies, abuse, and secrets. The horrifying truth was this: Rick Thorburn killed Tiali to protect his own son. Police investigations revealed that Rick's teenage son had been sexually abusing Tiali. When the possibility emerged that she might be pregnant, panic swept through the household. If the abuse was exposed, the entire family faced legal and social destruction. So Rick Thorburn made a decision. Instead of protecting the child placed in his care, he would silence her forever. On that October morning, after dropping off his other children, Thorburn murdered Tiali. Exactly how he killed her was never fully disclosed in court, but what was clear was the motive. He wanted to cover up his son's abuse and preserve the family's reputation. The cover-up was immediate and coordinated. Family members lied to police. Stories were rehearsed. A conspiracy was formed. But lies, like bodies, don't stay buried forever. The unraveling of the Thorburn family came piece by piece. First, inconsistencies in their stories. Then, confessions under pressure. Finally, in 2018, Rick Thorburn pleaded guilty to the murder of Tiali Palmer. The courtroom was packed with reporters, officials, and grieving community members. The prosecution laid bare the full horror. A foster father who not only failed in his duty to protect, but who actively murdered a child to shield his own son's crimes. Thorburn showed little emotion. To many observers, his lack of remorse was as chilling as the crime itself. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a lengthy non-parole period. Other family members also faced charges related to lying to police and attempting to obstruct justice. The body facade of the Thorburn family collapsed completely under the weight of their crimes. The murder of Tiali Palmer forced Australia to confront difficult questions. How could a child be placed in the care of such a dangerous man? How many red flags had been missed? The foster system, already under scrutiny, faced renewed criticism. Advocates demanded better screening, more oversight, and stronger protections for vulnerable children. The case became a rallying point for reform, though for Tiali, those reforms came far too late. Her memory was honored in vigils, memorials, and tributes across Queensland. Classmates described her as a bright, kind, and funny girl who deserved so much more than the fate handed to her. Mariusz Krężołek. Imagine a 4-year-old child, so emaciated that his ribs protrude through translucent skin, begging for a single morsel of food, while the adults who should protect him watch with cold indifference. This was the daily reality for Daniel Pelka in Coventry, England, where his stepfather, Mariusz Krężołek, orchestrated one of the most prolonged and systematic campaigns of child torture ever documented in British criminal history. The torture of Daniel Pelka wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was a carefully executed campaign of starvation, beatings, and psychological terror that unfolded over months. Krężołek, working in partnership with Daniel's mother, Magdalena Wuchak, transformed their Coventry home into a chamber of horrors where an innocent child was slowly murdered through deliberate cruelty. The starvation began gradually, almost imperceptibly. Daniel's food portions grew smaller while the adults around him ate normally. What started as reduced meals escalated into complete food deprivation for days at a time. The 4-year-old would scavenge for crumbs, desperately searching through garbage bins and begging neighbors for food. His tiny body began consuming itself, burning through muscle and fat as Krężołek watched his stepson waste away. But starvation was just one weapon in Krężołek's arsenal of cruelty. The physical beatings were systematic and brutal, designed to inflict maximum pain without immediately killing the child. Daniel's small body became a canvas of bruises, cuts, and welts as his stepfather used fists, belts, and household objects to inflict suffering. Each beating was followed by forced silence. Daniel learned that crying or screaming would only bring more violence. The psychological torture may have been even more devastating than the physical abuse. Krężołek would place food just out of Daniel's reach, forcing the starving child to watch others eat while he was denied even the smallest bite. The 4-year-old was made to understand that his stepfather held absolute power over his very survival. Whether he lived or died depended entirely on Krężołek's whims. Daniel's daily existence became a nightmare of hunger, pain, and terror. He would wake each morning not knowing if this would be the day he received food or another beating. His small frame grew so thin that his clothes hung like rags on his skeletal body. Neighbors later reported seeing him desperately searching through garbage, his hollow eyes reflecting the desperation of someone slowly dying of starvation. The escalation was methodical. As Daniel grew weaker from malnutrition, the beatings intensified. Krężołek seemed to take pleasure in the child's deteriorating condition, finding new ways to inflict suffering on someone who was already dying. The 4-year-old's body began shutting down, his immune system failing, his organs struggling to function without proper nutrition. What makes this case particularly horrifying is the duration of Daniel's suffering. This wasn't a momentary act of violence, but months of calculated torture inflicted upon a helpless child. Every day brought new horrors as Krężołek systematically destroyed his stepson's body and spirit. The little boy, who should have been playing with toys and learning to read, was instead fighting for survival against the man who was supposed to love him. The final stages of Daniel's life were marked by complete physical breakdown. His body, ravaged by starvation and repeated beatings, could no longer sustain life. Yet even as death approached, Krężołek showed no mercy. The 4-year-old's last days were filled with the same cruelty that had defined his existence under his stepfather's care: hunger, pain, and the crushing knowledge that no help was coming. Daniel Pełka died weighing just 22 pounds, less than many infants. His autopsy revealed the full extent of Krężołek's systematic torture: severe malnutrition, multiple healed and fresh fractures, extensive bruising, and internal injuries consistent with prolonged physical abuse. The medical evidence painted a picture of sustained cruelty that shocked even experienced forensic pathologists. The discovery of Daniel's condition sent shockwaves through the community and child protection services. How had such systematic abuse gone undetected for so long? How had a 4-year-old been slowly murdered through starvation and violence while living in plain sight? The answers revealed a perfect storm of manipulation, intimidation, and systemic failure that allowed Krężołek to torture his stepson to death. Krężołek's conviction for murder brought a life sentence, but justice came too late for Daniel Pelka, the stepfather who had systematically starved and beaten a 4-year-old to death. Would spend his remaining years in prison, where he eventually died, though his death was far more peaceful than the prolonged agony he inflicted on an innocent child. Daniel's story remains one of the most disturbing cases of stepfather abuse ever documented, a reminder that the most vulnerable members of society depend on adults for their very survival, and that betrayal of that trust can lead to unimaginable suffering and death. Bradley Wade Rietzi. What happens when the man trusted to guide a teenage girl into adulthood becomes her sexual predator and killer? In Calgary, Alberta, Bradley Wade Rietzi answered that question in the most horrifying way possible when he sexually assaulted and murdered his 7-year-old stepdaughter, Brittany McInnes, transforming from protector to predator in an act of betrayal that would shock an entire community. Brittany McInnes was on the cusp of adulthood, navigating the complex world of teenage relationships, school pressures, and planning for her future. At 17, she should have been worried about prom dates and college applications, not defending herself against the sexual advances of her stepfather. But within the walls of her Calgary home, Rietzi had been watching, waiting, and planning an assault that would end her young life. The transformation of Rietzi from stepfather to predator didn't happen overnight. The grooming process was likely subtle at first, inappropriate comments disguised as jokes, boundary violations presented as normal family interaction, and gradually escalating sexual behavior that left Brittany confused and trapped. She was living with a man who held authority over her daily life while harboring twisted sexual fantasies about her developing body. The sexual assault that preceded Brittany's murder reveals the calculated nature of Rietzi's crimes. This wasn't a momentary loss of control, but a deliberate decision to victimize someone who trusted him completely. Brittany would have been shocked by her stepfather's transformation from family protector to sexual predator, unable to comprehend how someone she called family could become her attacker. The physical overpowering of a 7-year-old girl by her adult stepfather represents one of the most profound betrayals possible in family dynamics. Rietzi used his position of authority and physical strength to force himself on someone who had every reason to believe she was safe in her own home. The terror Brittany must have experienced as she realized her stepfather's true intentions is almost unimaginable. But Rietzi's crimes escalated beyond sexual assault to murder, suggesting that Brittany either fought back or threatened to expose his actions. The strangulation that followed shows a calculated decision to eliminate the only witness to his sexual crimes. As Brittany gasped for air, she would have looked into the eyes of the man who was supposed to protect her and seen only cold determination to silence her forever. The method of murder, strangulation, is particularly intimate and personal. Unlike shooting or stabbing, strangling someone requires sustained physical contact, and the killer must watch their victim's life slowly ebb away. Rietzi would have felt Brittany's struggles gradually weaken, heard her desperate attempts to breathe, and watched the light fade from her eyes. This wasn't a crime of passion, but a methodical execution designed to cover up his sexual assault. The positioning and disposal of Brittany's body would have been Rietzi's next consideration. Having murdered his stepdaughter, he now faced the challenge of concealing his crimes from his wife, the community, and law enforcement. Every decision he made in those crucial hours after the murder revealed a man more concerned with avoiding consequences than dealing with the magnitude of what he had done. The investigation that followed would eventually uncover the truth about Rietza's double life. The stepfather, who presented himself as a caring family man, was revealed to be a sexual predator who had been planning and executing crimes against the teenager who trusted him most. Physical evidence would tell the story that Brittany could no longer tell herself, a story of betrayal, sexual violence, and murder. What makes Rietza's crimes particularly disturbing is the violation of the stepfather role itself. Society grants stepfathers tremendous access to and authority over their stepchildren, expecting that this power will be used for protection and guidance. Instead, Rietza weaponized this trust, using his position to isolate, assault, and ultimately murder the young woman who should have been able to count on his protection. The sexual motivation behind Brittany's murder adds another layer of horror to an already devastating crime. This wasn't just family violence, it was sexual predation that escalated to homicide when the victim couldn't be silenced any other way. Rietza had crossed every possible boundary, transforming from father figure to rapist to killer in a progression that defies comprehension. Brittany's final moments were filled with betrayal, terror, and the crushing realization that the man she had trusted with her safety was instead determined to destroy her. Her murder represents not just the loss of a young life, but the complete corruption of the family bonds that should have protected her from exactly this type of violence. The guilty plea that followed Rietza's arrest brought a life sentence, ensuring he would never again have the opportunity to victimize another young woman. But for Brittany McInnes, justice came too late. She had already paid the ultimate price for trusting the wrong man with her life and safety. Marcus Wesson, what if the man you called Dad was also your prophet, your abuser, and ultimately your executioner? The 12th of March, 2004, Fresno, California. Police officers arrive at a modest yellow house on Hammond Avenue for what they believe is a child custody dispute. But within hours, that house will become one of the darkest crime scenes in American history. Inside, officers will find 9 lifeless bodies, children and young women stacked on top of one another. The killer? Not a stranger, not a burglar, but the patriarch of the house himself, Marcus Wesson. To the outside world, Marcus Wesson seemed like just another eccentric father in Fresno. But behind closed doors, he was a self-anointed prophet, a cult leader, and, for many of his victims, both a father and stepfather. Wesson grew up in a strict, deeply religious household. By adulthood, he had carved out a twisted theology of his own, one that combined Seventh-day Adventist prophecy, vampire lore, and his own delusions of grandeur. He believed he was God's chosen. He believed his children were his property, and he believed he had the right to dictate every detail of their lives, including who they would marry, who they would bear children with, and how they would die. Inside his home, he ruled with absolute control. He dressed in long, flowing robes, wore his hair in dreadlocks, and preached to his children about sin, salvation, and loyalty. To outsiders, he was a recluse. To his family, he was untouchable. But what no one realized until it was too late was that Wesson's home was a carefully constructed prison. A prison where incest, brainwashing, and sexual abuse became daily realities. a prison where the line between father and husband blurred. The children, many of them born from incestuous unions between Wesson and his own daughters or stepdaughters, were raised to see him as both parent and Messiah. He told them the world outside was evil. He told them salvation lay in him alone. And he told them that if authorities ever tried to separate the family, they were to kill each other and themselves. On that March afternoon in 2004, police came to the house to take custody of several of the children after relatives reported abuse. Officers expected resistance. They expected maybe a shouting match. What they did not expect was mass death. When officers surrounded the home, Wesson stalled. A standoff ensued. Hours passed, and then gunfire. When police finally entered the home, they were met with a scene so grotesque that even veteran investigators wept. In a back bedroom, piled on top of one another, were 9 bodies. Children as young as 1 year old, young women barely out of their teens. All had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber revolver. The names of the victims echo like a litany of grief. Elizabeth, age 17, Aviv, age 7, Jonathan, age 7, Ethan, age 4, Sedona, age 1, and 4 other young relatives, daughters and stepdaughters of Wesson. The killers weren't outsiders, they weren't intruders, they were the victims themselves, coerced by years of indoctrination. Testimony later revealed that Wesson had drilled into them the idea of a death pact. If authorities came for the children, they were to take their lives before allowing them to be corrupted by the outside world. And who pulled the trigger? Prosecutors argued it was Wesson himself. But even if his hand wasn't on every bullet, his voice was. His ideology was the true weapon. His control was absolute. The trial of Marcus Wesson became a national spectacle. Reporters filled the courtroom. Survivors, some of them still loyal to Wesson, testified in his defense. They described him not just as their father, but as their Lord. Others, breaking away from years of manipulation, spoke of his iron grip, how he chose their husbands, how he forced incest, how he threatened damnation for disobedience. Prosecutors unveiled the revolver. They unveiled the writings where Wesson justified incest and polygamy. They unveiled the stories of children forced into sexual relationships with their father. The jury listened in stunned silence. In 2005, Marcus Wesson was convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of sexual abuse. His sentence, death. But even in the face of conviction, Wesson never admitted guilt. He never expressed remorse. In his mind, the deaths were part of God's plan. As of August 2025, Marcus Wesson remains on California's death row at San Quentin State Prison. His appeals have dragged through the courts for 2 decades. Execution in California remains rare due to moratoriums, but Wesson's name is still synonymous with one of the worst cases of family mass murder in U.S. history. The case left Fresno haunted, 9 caskets, 9 funerals, and a community asking, how could this happen in a simple neighborhood? How could so many people not see the warning signs? Experts point to cult psychology. Wesson isolated his family, controlled their finances, dictated their beliefs. Like Jim Jones in Jonestown or David Koresh in Waco, he created a closed system where only his voice mattered. And when authority closed in, He followed through on the ultimate act of control mass death. To this day, survivors struggle with the scars of that household. Some refuse to speak of it. Others, finally free, try to rebuild lives stolen by one man's delusion.